He almost missed the flight. Not because he was late. Daniel Brooks had never been late for anything in his life. Not a formation, not a mission, not a promise. He was standing at Gate 14 at JFK International Airport, a full 40 minutes before boarding, sitting quietly on a hard plastic chair with a worn leather duffel bag resting between his boots. Watching the morning crowd move around him like a river current, he had no intention of fighting. The departure board above the gate flickered. American Airlines. Flight 237, New York to Los Angeles, first class, on time. Daniel looked at his boarding pass one more time and folded it carefully, pressing the crease with his thumb the way he had learned to press map folds in the field, with patience and precision. He was wearing gray chinos, a plain navy button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, and a pair of black leather shoes that had been polished until they caught light, but not attention. There were no rank insignia on his collar, no ribbons on his chest, no military decals on his bag. Just a man, 60 years of living pressed into a body that still moved like it remembered what discipline felt like. He had not asked for the first-class upgrade. The Department of Veterans Affairs had arranged his travel to Los Angeles for the National Veterans Service Recognition Ceremony, a formal event held every 2 years at the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, to honor men and women whose military service had been deemed extraordinary by a review board of senior officials, decorated generals, and congressional representatives. Daniel had received the letter about the ceremony 8 weeks ago. He had read it twice, set it on his kitchen table in Richmond, Virginia, and then made himself a cup of coffee before reading it a third time. He was not the kind of man who got excited easily. The gate agent called first-class boarding at 7:22 in the morning. Daniel picked up his bag, adjusted the strap over his shoulder, and walked to the jet bridge with the unhurried calm of someone who had walked through far more uncertain thresholds than an airport gate. He smiled at the gate agent, a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced hospitality grin, and thanked her by name, reading it off her badge. Her expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with professional training. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin was arranged in 2 columns of wide leather seats in a deep charcoal gray. A few passengers were already seated. A flight attendant named Emily Carter, the cabin's lead for this flight, greeted Daniel at the entrance and offered to take his bag. He declined politely, thanking her with a kind of directness that didn't feel cold, just honest. He found his seat, 3A, window side, port aisle. He stowed his duffel in the overhead compartment with a careful precision that cleared space for whatever bag might follow his. Then he sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and looked out the window at the tarmac shimmering faintly in the July heat. He did not open a laptop. He did not pull out his phone. He sat with his hands on his thighs and watched the baggage carts make their slow circles below. Victor Langford boarded 4 minutes later. He was not a man who moved quietly through spaces. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that suggested he had once played something competitive, and a haircut that suggested he still wanted people to know it. He wore a slim-cut charcoal suit over an open-collar white shirt, no tie, because he had decided years ago that ties were for people who needed to prove something. His watch was a Patek Philippe in rose gold. His shoes were Italian. His carry-on was a monogrammed leather weekender that he swung overhead with the careless ease of someone who had never had to worry about overhead compartment space in his life. He was a managing partner at Langford Capital Group, a private equity firm based in Manhattan with a secondary office in Century City, Los Angeles. He had approximately $340 million in personal assets, depending on the quarter. He was also, by most measures that mattered to him, comfortable in first class. He had logged well over 200,000 miles with American Airlines, which meant he had grown accustomed to first class feeling a certain way, a quiet, ordered, premium sort of way, the kind of environment where the people around you understood what it had cost to be there. He took seat 3B. He settled in, accepted a glass of water from a flight attendant, adjusted the seat controls, and then let his gaze drift around the cabin, the way wealthy people sometimes do when they are assessing a room without appearing to assess it. His eyes moved from seat to seat with the bored confidence of a man who had categorized most of humanity into two groups: people worth knowing and people who happened to be present. His gaze landed on Daniel Brooks. Victor studied him for a moment. The gray chinos, the navy shirt, the leather duffel that had clearly been through years of actual use rather than aspirational purchase. No visible brand, no suit, no tablet or noise-canceling headphones, or any of the signals that, in Victor's experience, tended to confirm that a man belonged in a seat that cost what this one cost. He waited until the flight attendants had moved away before he leaned slightly in Danielle's direction. "Excuse me," Victor said, keeping his voice low and calibrated to a frequency that suggested courtesy without sincerity. "You know they accidentally seat people in the wrong section sometimes. The gate agents can get rushed. Just want to make sure you're in the right place." Daniel turned from the window and looked at Victor with dark, steady eyes. He said nothing for a moment. Not because he didn't have words, but because he had learned a long time ago that the first second after an insult belongs to the person delivering it. He let Victor sit in it. Then Daniel reached into the breast pocket of his shirt, produced his boarding pass, and held it out. His seat assignment was printed clearly: 3A, First Class. "I believe I am," Daniel said. His voice was unhurried. It held no anger, no performance of indignation, no invitation to escalate. It was simply the voice of a man who had spent decades learning the difference between a provocation worth responding to and a fire worth walking through. Victor glanced at the boarding pass and gave a small, unconvincing nod. "Of course," he said, in the tone of someone conceding a technicality rather than a point. He turned forward and accepted another glass of water from a passing attendant. But over the next 15 minutes, as the rest of the passengers boarded and the cabin filled, he made two more comments, both quiet, both deniable. One about whether the overhead bins were too full already, and one about how the airline had really started opening these cabins up to everyone. And both were directed at no one in particular, in the way that certain kinds of contempt have learned to travel without a clear return address. Daniel said nothing. Emily Carter, moving through the cabin with the sharp peripheral awareness of someone trained to prevent problems before they needed management, registered both comments. She caught the eye of a senior flight attendant near the galley and gave a small, meaningful look. The other woman nodded. They had both seen this before, in 100 variations, and they knew the calibration required. Keep the environment calm, de-escalate, without confrontation, document if necessary. Emily paused at Daniel's seat. "Mr. Brooks, can I get you anything before we close the doors? Sparkling water, orange juice, anything at all?" Daniel looked up at her and smiled. A real one, not a diplomatic performance. "Just some water would be wonderful, thank you." She brought it in 30 seconds. She brought it with the kind of attentiveness she gave to passengers who deserved it, rather than those who demanded it, which was a distinction she had learned over 11 years in the air. Daniel held the glass, looked out the window again, and thought about Los Angeles. He thought about the ceremony. He thought about the faces of the men and women who would be there, some of them young enough to still be surprised by their own survival, some of them old enough to carry the weight of it in their posture. He had been at events like this before, not as the honored guest, but as the quiet man standing in the back who had helped carry something heavy and then set it down without fanfare. He was not nervous. He was not proud, exactly. He was something that didn't have a clean word in English. A readiness, maybe. A composure built from understanding that some moments in life ask you to stand still while everything around you makes noise. The cabin doors closed. The aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. The morning light through Daniel's window was gold and flat, the way July light in New York gets before the heat makes it harsh. He watched the terminal buildings pass. He watched a young ground crew worker in an orange vest wave the plane forward with practiced, repetitive gestures, like someone conducting an orchestra no one was listening to. Daniel felt, in a way he hadn't expected, strangely at peace. He did not know that in approximately 38 minutes, the captain of this aircraft was going to say his name over an intercom system heard by every person in first class, business class, and economy. He did not know that a 60-second announcement was about to reach into the life of the man sitting 3 inches to his right and rearrange something fundamental in it. He just watched the runway come into view, felt the aircraft accelerate, and let New York fall away beneath him. The aircraft leveled at 35,000 feet somewhere over Pennsylvania, and the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off with the small, polite sound that always struck Emily Carter as slightly too cheerful for the altitude. She moved through the first-class cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent over a decade learning exactly how much attention each kind of passenger wanted, and exactly how little to give the kind who wanted too much. The cabin held 14 passengers this morning, a full complement, which meant the flight was generating solid revenue, a fact the airline's yield management system cared about considerably more than the interpersonal dynamics in row 3. Victor Langford had ordered a Bloody Mary the moment the bar service was authorized. He held it now against his knee with one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other, reviewing a term sheet for an acquisition that was supposed to close by end of quarter. He had spent most of the taxi and climb out composing himself, the way people do when they've said something they know lands in a gray area and have decided, without quite admitting it, that they meant every word of it. He glanced at Daniel once more. The man hadn't moved much. His posture was what Victor might have described, if pressed for accuracy, as military. Straight without rigidity, alert without tension, the body language of someone who had trained himself not to waste movement. It was the kind of stillness that Victor, in the calculus of status he carried everywhere, found mildly irritating. He was accustomed to the stillness of wealth, the stillness of people who had arrived somewhere, and no longer needed to prove it. But Daniel's stillness was something different. It didn't come from comfort. It came from somewhere else, and Victor couldn't quite locate it, which unsettled him in a way he declined to examine directly. He leaned slightly sideways. "So," he said with the warm, friendly tone of a man who has decided that casual conversation is a form of generosity he's extending, "what takes you to Los Angeles?" Daniel turned from the window. He looked at Victor with eyes that were unhurried and clear, and he considered the question the way he considered most things, not suspiciously, but carefully. "A ceremony," he said. "Business ceremony?" Victor asked. "Corporate?" "Not exactly," Daniel said. Victor waited, and when no elaboration came, he found himself filling the silence in a way that wasn't flattering to him. "Work in government?" "I served in the military," Daniel said. "Army. I'm retired now." Something moved through Victor's expression, a brief recalibration that didn't quite make it to his face before being replaced by the expression he'd intended. "Ah," he said, "good for you." The tone of it carried just enough of the condescension of someone who considers service admirable the way they consider marathons admirable. Fine for the people built for that kind of thing, but not really part of the world where decisions get made. Daniel nodded and returned his attention to the window. Victor had intended to let the conversation die there, but something in Daniel's composure, its completeness, its refusal to need anything from him, kept him talking. "So the government is flying you out?" he said. "Yes." "What branch?" "Department of Veterans Affairs." "So it's a veterans thing?" Daniel paused before answering, and the pause wasn't the pause of someone searching for words. It was the pause of someone deciding how many words were appropriate. "There's a national recognition ceremony every 2 years, he said, "for service members whose records have been reviewed by a military board. I was selected this year." Victor processed this with the expression of someone who is receiving more information than they expected, and is not sure whether it requires him to adjust his posture. "Huh," he said. What was the service for? Like, what did you do?" Daniel looked at him. "I was a master sergeant. I served 3 tours, 1 in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. My team was involved in several operations. One in particular had significant outcomes." The phrase "significant outcomes" was so deliberately restrained, so consciously understated, that Victor blinked for a moment, hearing it as evasive before understanding that it was, in fact, exactly the opposite. "Right," Victor said. He took a sip of his Bloody Mary. "Well, that's admirable. genuinely. And to his credit, for just a moment, he seemed to mean it. Before the moment passed, and he added, smoothly and without apparent awareness of what he was doing, "It's not always an easy adjustment coming back to civilian life. I've read quite a bit about it. The reintegration challenges, the financial side especially, can be rough." The implication was delivered with the practiced fluency of a man who had spent decades folding condescension inside concern. It landed where it was aimed. Daniel didn't react the way Victor expected, or perhaps the way Victor half hoped. He didn't stiffen. He didn't look away. He simply looked at Victor with an expression that was, if anything, faintly compassionate, the way a doctor might look at a patient presenting a symptom they've seen hundreds of times. "I manage fine," Daniel said. In the seat directly across the aisle, a woman named Patricia Okafor, 41 years old, a partner at a corporate law firm in Century City, traveling back from a deposition in Manhattan, had been watching the exchange from behind her reading glasses. She had a brief open on her tablet and had read the same paragraph 4 times without processing it, because the conversation 3 feet to her left had her full attention. She recognized what was happening. She had seen it before, in conference rooms and courtrooms and airport terminals. She also recognized Daniel's response, the brevity, the sufficiency of it, the lack of invitation to continue, and she felt something quiet move through her. Admiration, maybe? Or the particular kind of solidarity that comes from having learned the same lesson from different teachers. Emily Carter, passing through with a tray of pre-meal warm towels, distributed them with practiced ease, and paused at Daniel's seat long enough to catch his eye and give him a look that communicated something professional and something personal at the same time. "Let me know if you need anything at all, Mr. Brooks," she said. "Thank you, Emily," Daniel said. He used her name every time. The meal service began, a choice between pan-seared salmon with lemon copper sauce and a grilled chicken breast with herb-roasted vegetables. Daniel chose the chicken. Victor chose the salmon and spent 60 seconds explaining to the flight attendant that he preferred it medium rather than medium well, and that the last time he'd flown this route, the salmon had been overcooked, and that he trusted this crew was better than that. The flight attendant, young, 26, this was his 3rd month on the job, said he would pass the message to the galley with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Daniel ate with the uncomplicated attention of a man who has eaten military rations in worse conditions and finds airplane food, however it arrives, to be a kind of abundance. He ate everything on his plate. He thanked the crew when they cleared it. Victor had moved on from the conversation, or appeared to have. He was working again, headphones now around his neck rather than on his ears, the kind of half-presence that signals importance without requiring full commitment to a posture. But twice in the following 20 minutes, while Daniel sat quietly with a cup of coffee and looked at the cloud cover below the aircraft, Victor made comments, not directed at Daniel, not directly, but shaped so that anyone in the surrounding seats could hear them and understand the target. The first was about how the airline had democratized first class in ways that weren't entirely positive. The second was about how he understood they needed to fill seats, but that there used to be a certain consistency in the experience. A man in seat 2B, a physician from New York named Dr. Anand Mehta, who was traveling to a conference at UCLA, looked up from his laptop and looked at Victor with an expression of pure, unblinking assessment. He said nothing. He returned to his screen. Patricia Okafor set her tablet down with a quiet firmness. Emily Carter, in the galley, picked up the cabin phone. She wasn't calling the ground. She was calling the flight deck. "Captain," she said, when the line connected, "I want to make you aware of a situation in the first-class cabin. It's not a safety issue, but I think you should know who's sitting in 3A. There was a pause. Then Captain Michael Reynolds said very quietly, "Say the name." Emily said the name. There was a silence on the line that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In airline communication, 4 seconds of silence after a crew member speaks is unusual enough to notice. "I'll be right back to you," the captain said. Emily replaced the handset and returned to the cabin. She moved professionally, efficiently as she always did. But her jaw was set with the particular resolution of someone who has just triggered something they believe is going to matter. In seat 3A, Daniel Brooks finished his coffee, declined a refill, and asked if he could have a glass of water. He did not know that 30 feet forward and behind a reinforced cockpit door, a 56-year-old Air Force veteran turned commercial pilot was sitting in the left seat of a Boeing 737 with his hand resting still on the armrest, staring at the autopilot display and feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. He was feeling the weight of a debt he had carried for 17 years, and he was deciding what to do with it. Captain Michael Reynolds had been flying commercial aircraft for 21 years. The last 14 as a full captain with American Airlines. Before that, he had spent 16 years in the United States Air Force, flying everything from C-130 transport planes out of Fort Bragg to F-16s over the Persian Gulf. He had 18,400 flight hours. He had never had a serious incident. He had a reputation among his crew for being calm, fair, precise, and almost constitutionally uncomfortable with unnecessary conversation. He was not, in the general opinion of the people who had worked with him over 2 decades, a man who made announcements, not personal ones, not the kind that told passengers something about themselves, rather than about the aircraft or the weather or the estimated time of arrival. He sat in the left seat of the 737 now, with the aircraft flying itself at cruise altitude, and he held the cabin address handset with both hands and said nothing. His first officer, a 38-year-old pilot named James Wu, glanced at him from the right seat. He had flown with Reynolds 17 times and had never seen him hold the handset without speaking. "Captain?" Reynolds set the handset down. "I need a minute," he said, which was, for Michael Reynolds, the equivalent of a man who speaks rarely saying something extraordinary. He looked at the horizon line, which at 35,000 feet is a clean and unambiguous thing, a perfect boundary between blue sky above and the gray-white of cloud cover below, sharp and certain in a way the ground never is. He had always found altitude clarifying. You couldn't argue with the instruments. You couldn't negotiate with physics. Everything up here was honest in a way that, in his experience, very little on the ground managed to be. He thought about a morning in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, 17 years ago. He had been flying a different kind of aircraft then, a CH-47 Chinook helicopter on a search and rescue extraction mission, pulling a 5-man army team out of a compromised position in the mountains north of Asadabad. The mission had not gone the way it was supposed to go. No mission in Kunar province went the way it was supposed to go. His aircraft had taken fire on the approach. His co-pilot had been hit and incapacitated. One of the engines was running hot and losing power by the second. He had managed to put the aircraft down in a mountain clearing that was technically unsuitable for a Chinook landing. Too small, too uneven, too exposed. And what he'd thought at the time was a controlled emergency landing had become, almost immediately, a life or death situation on the ground. There had been a man, an Army Master Sergeant who had been leading the ground team they'd come to extract. He hadn't waited for the situation to organize itself. He had taken cover fire, organized his men with the controlled efficiency of someone who had reduced panic to a mechanical problem, and this was the part Michael Reynolds had never been able to describe accurately in the 3 official reports and 2 informal conversations he had allowed on the subject. He had doubled back, not forward, back, toward the disabled aircraft, toward the fire. He had pulled Reynolds and his co-pilot out of the cockpit manually, under direct fire, with a calm that Reynolds later described to his wife as the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed. Because calm in that kind of moment is not natural. It is the product of something that has been built at great cost over a great deal of time, and Michael Reynolds had not fully understood what he was looking at until it was over. He had never forgotten the name. He had carried it the way you carry something you're afraid to set down because you're not sure what happens to you when you do. Daniel Brooks. He picked up the handset. "James," he said to his first officer, "I need to make an announcement. It's not standard. I want to brief you on it so you understand what's happening." James Wu turned and gave him his full attention. Reynolds told him the short version. 60 seconds, no elaboration, just the facts. Who was on this aircraft? What that man had done 17 years ago. what it meant to him personally. When he finished, James Wu was quiet for 3 seconds. "Do it," he said. Reynolds pressed the button for the cabin address system. The soft triple-tone chime sounded through the aircraft. Forward cabin, mid-cabin, aft. The same sound that typically preceded weather updates or altitude information, or the news that the flight path over Colorado had been adjusted for turbulence. Every passenger who was awake heard it. Most of them looked up. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking from the flight deck. I want to take a moment to depart from our usual service updates to share something with you that I feel is important." In the first-class cabin, Victor Langford looked up from his laptop with the mild irritation of a man being interrupted from something he considers more significant than whatever the intercom has to say. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the window. "Traveling with us in first class today is a man named Daniel Brooks, a retired Master Sergeant of the United States Army. I want to tell you something about this man that he would never tell you himself, because that's the kind of man he is." Victor's expression changed. It was subtle, a shift in the jaw, a slight stillness in the hand holding his reading glasses. But it was there. 17 years ago, I was flying a military extraction mission in a combat zone in Afghanistan. My aircraft was disabled. My co-pilot was wounded. I was on the ground and in significant danger of not getting back up. Master Sergeant Brooks, leading the ground team we had come to extract, turned around when he didn't have to, came back through direct enemy fire, and pulled me and my co-pilot out of that aircraft. He organized the remainder of the rescue under conditions that I will not describe in detail, because this is a commercial flight and you don't need that imagery. But I will tell you that what he did that day was not ordinary. It was not the result of luck or accident. It was the result of who he is. Emily Carter stood at the forward galley entrance, arms at her sides, not moving. Patricia Okafor had removed her reading glasses. Dr. Anand Mehta had closed his laptop. Victor Langford had set down his reading glasses on his tray table. He was looking at the back of seat 3A. His face was very still. Master Sergeant Brooks is traveling today to receive a National Military Service Recognition Award in Los Angeles, an honor he has almost certainly not mentioned to the people around him, because, again, that's who he is. He saved my life. He saved several others that day. He served 3 tours and came home, and he has spent his life since then being exactly the kind of man this country is lucky to have. A pause. 1 second. 2. I would ask that you join me in thanking him. The handset clicked off. The cabin was silent for approximately 2 full seconds, the specific silence that precedes something irreversible. Then it began. It began with Dr. Mehta, who started clapping quietly and deliberately, the way someone who has made a considered decision claps. Then Patricia Okafor joined, her applause steady and firm. Then the couple in 4A and 4B, a retired teacher and her husband from New Jersey, who had been watching the whole situation with the helpless, clear-eyed discomfort of people who know something is wrong and haven't been given permission to say so yet. Then the young man in 1B who was 23 and traveling to Los Angeles for a software job and had barely registered what was happening until now, but found himself standing up without quite knowing when he'd decided to. Then, in a cascade that moved through business class and down the aisle and back through economy in a wave of sound and motion, the passengers of American Airlines Flight 227 stood up. Daniel Brooks turned from the window. He looked at the cabin around him. His expression did not break. His composure held. But there was something in his eyes, something that Emily Carter, who was watching him from the forward galley with her hand pressed flat against the cabin wall, would later describe to her husband that evening as the look of a man who had spent a very long time believing that the things he had done were enough, that they didn't need to be acknowledged, that the accounting was settled and private. The look of a man who, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, was allowing the accounting to be public. He nodded, once, deeply, the way you nod when words are inadequate, and you have the wisdom to know it. And Victor Langford in seat 3B sat perfectly still with his hands in his lap and said absolutely nothing. The applause lasted longer than applause usually does. Commercial flights have their own rhythms, their own physics of attention. The window of collective feeling is narrow, because people are tired and managed, and carrying the low-grade anxiety of being enclosed in a metal tube at altitude with strangers. But this one stretched. It lasted past the point where people were applauding and into the point where they were doing something else, honoring maybe, or releasing something they hadn't known they were holding. It died down gradually, the way the tide pulls back, and the cabin settled into a different kind of quiet than it had held before. Not the polite, pressurized quiet of a routine flight. Something warmer, something that had been earned. Emily Carter moved through the cabin with the attentive efficiency she always brought to her work, but her eyes were bright in a way she allowed herself because she was among professionals, and they would understand. She paused at seat 3A. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "from all of us." Daniel looked at her. "You made the call," he said. She shook her head. "The captain made the announcement." "You called him," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Emily held his gaze for a moment and then said nothing, because nothing was the right answer. In the seats around Daniel, the atmosphere had shifted in the specific way that shared experience shifts the physics of proximity. People who had been strangers separated by armrests and laptop screens and the practiced indifference of air travel were now occupying the same emotional space. Patricia Okafor leaned slightly across the aisle. "That was remarkable," she said. "Thank you for your service." She said it without the faint, performative quality the phrase sometimes carries. She said it the way you say something when you've just been given context you didn't have before. Daniel inclined his head. "Thank you for your witness," he said. It was an unusual response, and it took her a moment to understand it. She nodded slowly. Dr. Mehta from seat 2B turned around. He was a cardiologist, which meant he had spent 22 years making rapid assessments of what he was looking at. And what he was looking at now was a man of exceptional internal structure. He didn't say anything about the announcement. He said simply, "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" The question was entirely medical in its intention and entirely human in its effect. Daniel smiled. "I'm well, thank you, doctor." Mehta nodded, turned back around, and opened his laptop again. But he did it with the particular composure of someone who has been given something and knows it. Victor Langford had not moved. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, in the way that people sit when they have had a significant portion of their self-image reorganized without their consent and haven't yet found the new arrangement. The Bloody Mary on his tray table had gone watery from melting ice. His laptop screen had gone dark from inactivity. He was staring at the seat back in front of him, with the expression of a man examining something in himself that he preferred not to look at directly. He was not a person who experienced regret frequently. His professional environment rewarded decisiveness and penalized retrospection. You made calls, you moved markets, you allocated capital, and you did not spend a great deal of time auditing the secondary effects of the confidence that had made you successful. He had cultivated that confidence for 30 years. It had made him $340 million. It had also, he was beginning to understand, made him into the person who had sat next to Daniel Brooks and decided, before the man had spoken a word, that he did not belong there. He thought about the comments he had made. The wrong section question. The remarks about the cabin being democratized. The crack about reintegration. He had not, at the time, experienced them as contempt. He had experienced them as observation, as social intelligence, as the reasonable product of pattern recognition applied to visual information. He was beginning to understand the difference between pattern recognition and something uglier, and the understanding was not comfortable. He turned to Daniel. For a moment he said nothing, because the moment required something he wasn't sure he had the vocabulary for. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." His voice was quieter than it had been all flight. It lacked the calibrated warmth of professional pleasantry. It was, possibly for the first time in this conversation, honest. Daniel looked at him. His eyes were steady and clear, without coldness, without performance. "I made assumptions about you," Victor said, "before you had said a word. Based on, I don't know, things that don't matter. Things I'm not going to use as an excuse because they aren't one. I was disrespectful and I'm sorry. The words came out in a steady line, not rehearsed sounding, but not halting either. Victor Langford, whatever his considerable flaws, was a man who had spent his career delivering difficult messages in high-stakes rooms. He could apologize in a straight sentence when he decided to. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I accept your apology." He said it without drama, without qualification, without any implication that he had been waiting for it, or that it was more than what it was. He said it the way someone accepts a thing that is offered sincerely and held to its appropriate size. Victor nodded. He seemed to be working out what came next, what the protocol was for continuing to exist in a seat next to a man you had treated poorly, and who had treated you with more dignity in return than you had earned. "Can I ask you something?" Victor said. "You can ask," Daniel said. Victor considered his words. He was accustomed to rooms where precision mattered, where the wrong framing of a question cost you the deal. He tried to find the right frame. "How do you—" He stopped. Started again. "You didn't react when I made those comments. You sat there. I don't know if I could do that." Daniel looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I've been in situations," he said, "where reacting to the wrong thing at the wrong time costs people their lives. I don't mean that as a—" He paused, searched for the word. "Not as a comparison. I just mean that I learned early on that what other people say about you is information. It tells you about them. How you respond to it, that tells you about yourself. I decided a long time ago what I wanted that information to say." Victor absorbed this. "You weren't angry," he said. "I didn't say that," Daniel said. "But anger is a resource. You spend it where it matters." Victor sat with this. His financial mind, trained to evaluate leverage and allocation, found itself unexpectedly engaged by the metaphor. He had spent anger carelessly for most of his life, in traffic, in negotiations, in restaurants where the service was slow. And the idea that it was a finite commodity to be allocated with intention struck him as both obvious and somehow something he had never once considered. Across the aisle, Patricia Okafor was listening without appearing to listen, her tablet open, but her attention entirely on seat 3A and 3B. She was thinking about a court case she had argued 3 months ago involving workplace discrimination. And she was thinking about the way Daniel Brooks had sat in that seat for 2 hours under the weight of Victor Langford's condescension and had not given it a single inch of territory. She thought, that's what integrity looks like when it's not performing. Emily Carter brought Daniel a second cup of coffee without being asked, because she had learned his order in the first 20 minutes, and because she believed that some people deserved to have their order remembered. Daniel accepted it with a thank you, turned slightly toward the window, and let the flight resume around him. Outside, at 35,000 feet, the clouds below had broken into a scattered architecture, islands and canyons of white over the brown and green geometry of the middle of the country. Daniel looked at it the way he always looked at things from this altitude, with the particular affection of someone who had spent enough time close to the ground to understand what it meant to see it clearly from above. He thought about Los Angeles. He thought about the ceremony. He thought about the faces of the men and women who would be there, the ones who had carried things in silence for years, some of them younger than his youngest nephew, some of them old enough to have served in conflicts that people had stopped talking about the moment they became inconvenient. He thought about Michael Reynolds. He had not known the captain was on this flight. The letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs had told him only the route and the departure time. That Reynolds was here. That the universe, or probability, or whatever mechanism governed the distribution of such things, had put them on the same aircraft on this particular morning felt, to Daniel, less like fate, and more like the kind of coincidence that teaches you something if you're paying attention. He took a sip of his coffee and decided quietly that he would find a way to speak to Reynolds before the flight was over. Not to say anything grand, just to say, "I'm glad you made it." Because that was the thing about saving someone's life. It wasn't over when you pulled them out. It kept going. Every year they were alive, every year they were flying their aircraft and coming home to whoever was waiting for them. That was part of it too. That was the long dividend of a single terrible morning in the mountains of Kunar province. Daniel finished his coffee and set the cup down with the quiet precision of a man who has learned that how you handle small things is the same skill as how you handle large ones. Somewhere over Utah, the flight entered its third hour, and the aircraft settled into the particular steadiness of a long cruise. The engines holding their note, the autopilot making its invisible adjustments, the cabin achieving the drowsy equilibrium of people who have eaten and are now somewhere between sleep and surrender. Victor Langford did not sleep. He sat with his laptop open to the term sheet that needed his attention, but the cursor had not moved in 40 minutes. He was a man accustomed to forward motion, to decisions made and executed, to problems identified and resolved, to time structured around productivity in increments small enough to account for. He did not sit still. He did not do the particular kind of reflection that asked him to examine something in himself, rather than something in the market. He did it now. There was a memory he kept coming back to, one that he hadn't thought about in years, and that was arriving now, with an odd insistence. He was 12 years old. He was in a suburban neighborhood in New Jersey, in the school gymnasium, watching a school assembly about community service that he had already decided he was too sophisticated for. A man in his 50s had come to talk about his work with veterans organizations. He ran a nonprofit out of Newark, helping former service members navigate the VA bureaucracy and find stable housing. Victor remembered nothing the man had said. He remembered only that the man had been wearing a sweater that wasn't very good, a tan thing with a small stain near the pocket, and that Victor had thought, with the precocious cruelty of a certain kind of 12-year-old, nobody important dresses like that. He had been 12. The thought had never left him. It had only grown more sophisticated, more efficient, more socially legible. It had taken on the grammar of financial discernment, of taste, of pattern recognition refined by experience. It had stopped being something he noticed and started being something he used. He looked at the back of Daniel's headrest. He thought about $340 million. He thought about a helicopter cockpit in the mountains of Afghanistan, a man running back through fire, a pilot who was alive today because of a decision made in 1 second under conditions Victor could not fully imagine and had never tried to. The math was not complicated, but the emotional arithmetic, the recalculation of what constituted significance, what constituted weight, what the actual hierarchy of human value looked like when you stripped away the signals he had spent a lifetime learning to read, that math was considerably harder. He had a daughter, 22, just graduated from Dartmouth, working at a consulting firm in Boston. She had called him 2 months ago after reading an article about wealth inequality, and had asked him something that he had responded to with a patience he hadn't fully felt. Whether he thought the way he talked about people without money was the same as the way people with money talked about people of other backgrounds. He had told her it wasn't the same thing. That financial performance was a meritocratic signal. He thought about that call now. He thought his daughter had probably been right. 2 rows back, a couple in their late 60s, the retired teacher, Eleanor Marsh, and her husband, Robert, were talking quietly. Eleanor had been watching the situation in row 3 with the steady attention of a woman who had spent 40 years in a 7th grade classroom and had developed, out of professional necessity, an accurate radar for the moment when something important was happening between people. She leaned toward Robert. "That man, the veteran," she said, keeping her voice below the ambient noise of the cabin. "I watched the whole thing from the minute that other man sat down." Robert, who trusted his wife's assessments of human situations considerably more than his own, nodded. "And he never once gave him the satisfaction of a reaction," Eleanor said. "Not once. The man threw at him everything short of a direct insult, and he just sat there and was himself." Robert thought about this. "Some people learn that," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "Some people are made that. It's different." In seat 5C, across the aisle and back 2 rows, a 28-year-old named Marcus Webb had been listening to music since before takeoff and had pulled one earbud out when the captain's announcement came through. He was a black man traveling to Los Angeles to visit his grandmother, and he had watched the morning's events with the particular alert attention of someone who had learned to read rooms the way Daniel had learned to read terrain. quickly, accurately, with attention to exits. He had seen Victor's comments, he had seen Daniel's responses. He had seen the applause, and he had joined it. And afterward he had sat for a long time thinking about the strange, exhausting mathematics of having to be that patient, that composed, that continuously dignified in the face of something that had no business being directed at you. He thought, I wonder if he ever just gets tired. And then he thought, I wonder if that's the wrong question. At 11:47 a.m. Mountain Time, Captain Reynolds's voice returned to the cabin address system. This time, it was the standard kind of announcement. The aircraft was beginning its descent toward Los Angeles International Airport. Current weather was clear and sunny at 82 degrees. Expected arrival was approximately 40 minutes ahead. Standard. Procedural. The ordinary language of arrival. But Emily Carter, listening from the forward galley, heard something in Reynolds's voice that wasn't usually there. A very slight evenness, a deliberateness of tone, as if he were managing something that the autopilot was handling perfectly fine, but that he was choosing to manage anyway, because it was better to have both hands on something than neither. She understood that feeling. As the aircraft began its descent, the conversation in the first-class cabin resumed. Doctor. Mehta had turned his seat slightly to speak with Daniel, asking him about the ceremony in Los Angeles, about what the program looked like. Daniel described it briefly. A formal dinner, some remarks from congressional representatives, a presentation of the award itself, and then a period he was looking forward to, which was the informal gathering of veterans from various branches who would come together, away from the microphones and the podium, and just talk. That's the part that matters most, Daniel said. Just being in a room with people who understand. Mehta nodded. I think I know what you mean, actually. Medical conferences, the sessions are fine. It's the dinner after. Daniel smiled. It was a fuller smile than any he'd shown all morning. Exactly. Victor was listening. He didn't look like he was listening. He had his laptop positioned to suggest he was working. But he was listening, and he was hearing something that he couldn't quite name. Something that was adjusting the internal calibration he brought to the world. It was the conversation itself, not its content so much as its texture, the ease of it, the mutual recognition between two men who had never met before this morning, and who were speaking now with the specific warmth of people who have found common ground in an unlikely place. Victor spent most of his professional life in rooms full of people who looked like him and moved like him, and had learned to want the same things he wanted. He had built an entire existence inside a particular frequency. He was realizing, with an uncomfortable clarity, that he had mistaken the frequency for the whole spectrum. Patricia Okafor had put her tablet away entirely and was looking out her window at the descending landscape, the brown geometry of the Nevada desert giving way to the gray-white expanse of the greater Los Angeles basin, the spider web of freeways, the dull shimmer of the Pacific visible as a silver line at the edge of the horizon. She was thinking about something her mother had said to her years ago, after a particularly difficult first year of law school, that the most dangerous kind of underestimation is the kind that's never corrected. That when people decide who you are based on what they see before you speak, and that assessment is never challenged, something calcifies. In the person making the assessment, not in you. She had lived the inverse, the version where the assessment gets corrected, more times than she could count. She understood its value and its cost. What she had watched today, she thought, was the corrective working in real time, at altitude, without anyone having planned for it. The aircraft continued its descent. Los Angeles grew below them, gray and vast and glittering, the Pacific turning from silver to blue as the sun angle changed, the city spreading in every direction with the particular indifference of geography that does not know or care what has happened to the people traveling above it. Daniel pressed his hand flat on the armrest and looked down at the city that was receiving him. He was ready. The aircraft broke through a light layer of coastal cloud at 8,000 feet, and the San Fernando Valley opened below like a diorama. Green neighborhoods, dry hills, the snaking silver of the LA River, the grid of streets radiating toward downtown. A city that never looked the same twice from above, that changed character block by block, that carried more histories in its geography than any one person could track. Daniel had been to Los Angeles 4 times in his life. Once during a brief leave from Fort Bragg in his late 20s, when he had driven down the PCH with a fellow sergeant who had grown up in Inglewood and who had wanted to show him what the Pacific looked like from the right angle. Once on a Department of Defense assignment in his mid-40s that had taken him to Camp Pendleton for 3 days of joint service briefings. Once for the funeral of a man he had served with, a soldier from Compton who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan only to lose his health to complications from service-related injuries 5 years after coming home. This was the 4th time. He thought it might be the most complicated. The descent continued, the autopilot adjusting the aircraft's angle of attack with fractions of a degree of precision, the engines pulling back to a lower note, the cabin filling with the small sounds of preparation, bags being zipped, seats being returned to upright, electronic devices being put away in compliance with flight crew instructions. Emily Carter moved through the cabin doing what she always did in the final approach phase, confirming window shades, checking tray tables, ensuring everything was in the configuration that the approach procedure required. She was efficient and thorough, and she was also doing something else that she was less officially doing. She was watching the cabin with the particular attention of someone who knew that what had happened on this flight was not finished, that it had a momentum of its own that the landing wouldn't stop. She paused at seat 3B. Victor Langford had his seatbelt fastened and his tray table up and his laptop stored. He was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man managing a transition. Emily had seen that expression before. People arriving somewhere they hadn't expected to arrive, having traveled farther than the distance between airports. "How are you doing?" she asked. She asked it with the professional care of a crew member monitoring passenger well-being. Victor looked at her. He seemed to consider several possible answers before settling on the one that was true. "I have some thinking to do," he said. Emily nodded. "We all do," she said. "Sometimes that's the most productive trip." She moved on. In seat 3A, Daniel had his eyes forward now rather than out the window. The approach into LAX from the east brought you in over the south end of the city, over Inglewood and El Segundo, close enough to the residential neighborhoods that you could see backyard pools and school buildings and the tiny moving shapes of cars on the freeways. Daniel was looking at it without the distanced contemplation of the cruise altitude. He was close to the ground. He could feel the city's specific gravity pulling the aircraft down. He was thinking about the ceremony, about the award, about the name of the operation that the Army had eventually declassified and entered into the citation review process. He was thinking about the other men who had been there, 4 of them who were still alive, 3 of whom he was going to see in Los Angeles. He was thinking about the 4th one, who was not alive, who had never gotten to fly home on any aircraft, who had not been extracted. He thought about Private First Class Anthony Osei, 22 years old, from Accra, Ghana, via Atlanta, Georgia, who had enlisted in the Army at 19 and had been the youngest member of Daniel's team, and who had been killed in the initial contact that had forced the emergency extraction, who had given Daniel his extra ammunition before the position collapsed, who had said, in the last coherent exchange between them, "Make sure they get out, Sarge," with the specific, clear-eyed calm of someone who has decided what matters. Daniel had made sure they got out. He thought about Anthony every time he flew somewhere. He didn't know why the altitude triggered it specifically. Maybe because it was where Anthony had never gotten to go, in the direction he had never gotten to travel, up and away from the thing that had taken him. Daniel pressed his thumb to the inside of his wrist, a small private gesture he had made for 17 years, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you'd have to be watching very closely to notice. Marcus Webb, 2 rows back, noticed it. He didn't know what it meant, but he recognized it as the gesture of someone carrying something. He looked away. The aircraft touched down at LAX at 12:34 p.m. Pacific Time, a smooth landing at the end of runway 24L, the kind of arrival that experienced flyers barely register, the tires meeting the asphalt with a sound like a firm handshake, the thrust reversers engaging, the aircraft slowing through the familiar deceleration sequence toward the taxiway. And then, Before any of the post-landing routines could begin, before the seatbelt sign chimed off, before the cabin filled with the clicking of belts being released and the shuffling of bags being retrieved, the cabin address system activated. Captain Reynolds' voice came through one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Los Angeles International Airport, local time 12:34 p.m., and it is a beautiful afternoon here. Before we get to our gate, I want to take one more moment." The cabin stilled. "Master Sergeant Brooks, Daniel, I know you'd walk off this plane the same way you walked on, without asking for anything, without expecting anything, with the same quiet dignity you've carried your whole life. But I'm going to ask everyone one more time to recognize him." The applause began immediately this time. No delay, no building. It was there. But what Reynolds said next was what would stay with people. "The ceremony in Los Angeles is going to honor him with a medal and a citation and a room full of officials. That's appropriate. He deserves every word of it. But what I want you to know is that for me, and for a lot of people who wore a uniform, the honor started 17 years ago, in a place that most of you will never have to go, when a man made a decision to go back instead of forward. We are all in some way on this aircraft because of the people who made that choice. So thank you, Daniel. Welcome home." The applause in first class was on its feet, and this time, 2 rows back, Marcus Webb stood up with both hands, and in business class, a young woman in her 30s who had been a Marine for 6 years before separating stood up and brought both hands together with the focused, deliberate intensity of someone who knows precisely what they're honoring. And in row 3B, Victor Langford stood up. He didn't clap immediately. He stood first, as if the standing itself was the thing that needed to happen before he could move his hands. And then he clapped. Not the practiced social applause of a function or a gala, but something slower and more deliberate, the kind of applause that carries weight. Daniel turned and looked at him. Their eyes met. Victor held his gaze without looking away. Daniel nodded, the same nod as before. Once, deeply. And then he looked around the cabin at the people who were on their feet for him, and he felt, again, that strange public accounting of something he had carried privately for years. And he let it happen. He let it happen. That was the most courageous thing about it, really. Not the act in Kunar province, not the years of service, not the humility with which he'd absorbed Victor's condescension. The most courageous thing was this, letting the gratitude in, not deflecting it, not minimizing it, not retreating into the comfortable posture of a man who believes his worth is not in need of acknowledgement. He let it in. He let all of it in. The gate was C-42, and the jet bridge smelled like every jet bridge in every airport, a combination of industrial carpet, recycled air, and the faint ghost of 100 previous arrivals. Daniel walked it with his duffel over one shoulder and his boarding pass folded in his pocket, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who has learned that arrival, in any form, is worth taking seriously. He was the third person off the aircraft. Emily Carter was standing at the aircraft door when he reached it. "It was a privilege," she said, and she meant it in the precise, unornamented way that the word is supposed to be used before it becomes polite convention. Daniel stopped. He looked at her. "You made a difference today," he said. "The phone call to the flight deck. You did that without knowing what would happen, and it mattered. That's courage, too." Emily, who had managed hundreds of thousands of flight hours worth of events and emergencies and difficult passengers without losing her professional composure, felt the back of her throat tighten in a way that surprised her. "Have a safe ceremony," she said. "Thank you, Emily," he said. He walked up the jet bridge. In the terminal, the arrivals hall at Terminal 4 had the mid-afternoon energy of a major airport. A controlled chaos of rolling luggage and flight boards, and the ambient noise of 1,000 simultaneous decisions about where to be and how fast. Daniel moved through it with the ease of a man who has navigated genuine confusion and finds airports, by comparison, straightforwardly legible. He was looking for the arrival area, where the ceremony organizers had said there would be someone to meet him. He was not looking for what he found. At the base of the escalator near the baggage claim entrance, standing with the specific posture of people who have coordinated their arrival around someone else's, There were 8 of them. His sister, Carolyn, 53 years old, who had driven from Long Beach that morning, and who was holding a small American flag because she had decided it was appropriate, and if anyone had tried to talk her out of it, she would have declined. His brother-in-law, Jerome. 2 of his nephews, Marcus, who was 26 and had recently enrolled in a community college after years of the kind of aimlessness that can follow a difficult adolescence, and Deshawn, who was 23 and working at a logistics company, and who had never, until his uncle's letter arrived, fully understood what Daniel had done in the army. There was a man named Harold Sims, who was 74 years old and had served in Vietnam and had been Daniel's mentor when Daniel was a young sergeant trying to understand what it meant to lead rather than just command. Harold was holding a paper coffee cup and wearing a VFW cap and looking at the arriving passengers with the patient stillness of someone who has learned that most of the good things in life involve waiting. There was a woman named Sergeant First Class, retired, Diane Reyes, 48 years old, who had served under Daniel's command in his last deployment, and who had traveled from Phoenix for the ceremony, and who was currently the director of a veterans transition program that had helped nearly 200 former service members find stable employment in the past 3 years. And there was a young man named Calvin Osei, 24 years old, who was the nephew of Private First Class Anthony Osei, who had driven from his apartment in Inglewood with a single purpose that had taken him weeks to decide on, and that he still was not entirely certain was the right call, but that felt, in the marrow of something he couldn't name, necessary. Daniel came down the escalator and saw them all. He stopped at the bottom. Carolyn reached him first, because that was what older sisters do, and she held him with the specific firmness of someone who has not forgotten that she was 8 years old when he was born, and has therefore been responsible for him in some small, permanent way for every year since. "You look tired," she said into his shoulder. "I'm fine," he said. "You always say that. It's always true." Jerome shook his hand with both of his, the way men of a certain generation and certain understanding shake hands, and said nothing, which was the right amount to say. His nephews hugged him with the slightly self-conscious affection of young men who are learning that it's acceptable to show the things they feel. Daniel held each of them for a moment longer than protocol required, because he had learned that the moments we allow ourselves to hold on a little longer are the ones we return to when we need something solid. Harold Sims waited until the family had done what family does and then stepped forward and offered his hand. Daniel took it and then pulled him into a brief embrace. "Still standing?" Harold said. "Both of us," Daniel said. Diane Reyes gave him a salute, not the stiff, formal version, but the kind that means something personal, and he returned it. And then Calvin Osei stepped forward. He was tall, with his uncle's cheekbones and his uncle's specific way of carrying uncertainty with dignity, and he said, "Mr. Brooks, Master Sergeant, I'm Calvin, Anthony's nephew." Daniel went still, not the still of shock, the still of recognition, of a name arriving that he had been carrying for 17 years, and had never expected to hear from the mouth of someone with Anthony's face. "I know who you are," Daniel said. "I wanted to come," Calvin said, "to say thank you. My family, we know what you tried to do. What you did get everyone else out. My aunt, she wanted to come, but she wasn't well enough to travel, so she asked me to come for her, to tell you that we don't, that we've never blamed." He stopped, started again with the control of someone who has rehearsed a thing, and found that the actual moment makes the rehearsed words land wrong. "She wanted you to know that Anthony talked about you. In his letters home, he said you were the kind of leader that made people want to be better than they thought they could be." Daniel's composure held. His composure always held. But something in his eyes did the thing that composure is designed to protect, and yet cannot. Finally, stop. "I think about him," Daniel said. "I think about him every time I fly somewhere." Calvin nodded. "I figured you might," he said. "That's why I wanted to be here when you landed." They shook hands, and then Daniel did something he hadn't planned. He put his other hand over Calvin's and held it for a moment, the specific gesture of a man transferring something across a distance that cannot otherwise be crossed. "Your uncle was braver than I could ever have asked him to be," Daniel said. He made it possible to save the others. I want you to know that. Calvin said, I know. He would have wanted you to receive this award. I know, Daniel said. That's why I'm here. Behind Daniel, the last passengers from Flight 227 were arriving through the escalators and flowing around this small, still center of the arrivals hall. Most passed without looking. A few slowed, registering something without knowing what it was. The quality of stillness in a moving crowd. The posture of people gathered around something that matters. Among the last to come down the escalator were Victor Langford and Patricia Okafor, who had exchanged 5 words on the aircraft and now found themselves descending into the same moment without having arranged to. Victor saw the gathering. He understood immediately what it was. He recognized Danielle's sister, recognized the posture of the man with the VFW cap, recognized the gathering as something private and significant. He did not insert himself. He walked past at a respectful distance, and as he passed, he looked at Daniel's profile for a moment, the straight posture, the hand still holding Calvin's, and he looked away. He had his car service waiting at the curb. He had a meeting in Century City at 3:30. He had the remainder of a professional life to conduct, full of the decisions and allocations and assessments that constituted his work in the world. He had also, somewhere between New York and Los Angeles at 35,000 feet, begun a conversation with himself that he had no idea how to finish. He walked through the sliding glass doors into the California afternoon. The Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center stands at the top of a long drive through the campus in Westwood, visible from the freeway in the way that buildings of purpose often are. Not imposing exactly, but present, occupying space in a way that suggests the things happening inside it matter. The Veterans Ceremony was held in a conference center adjacent to the main building, in a room large enough for 300 people, and with windows that looked out over the campus to the hills beyond. Daniel arrived at 4 o'clock with Carolyn and Jerome and his nephews and Harold Sims and Diane Reyes and Calvin Osei, and they were greeted at the entrance by ceremony organizers who had name tags and programs and the efficient warmth of people who understand that the logistics of an event like this require precision, and the human moments inside it require space. The room was filling when they entered. There were perhaps 40 veterans already present, men and women ranging from their mid-20s to their mid-80s, representing every branch, every era since Korea, carrying between them a weight of experience that the conference center's institutional carpet and overhead lighting could only barely begin to contain. They wore their service in different ways, some in dress uniforms with ribbons and decorations, some in civilian clothes with a single subtle insignia on a lapel or a cap, some in the quiet of posture and attention that no longer needed external signaling because it had become structural. Harold Sims was the oldest person in the room by some years, and he moved through it with the particular authority of someone who has outlasted most of the reasons for urgency. He found a seat near the front and settled into it and began talking to the woman to his left, a retired Army lieutenant colonel in her 70s who had served in the Gulf War and was now running a nonprofit in Denver, because Harold Sims had never met a veteran he couldn't find common ground with in the first 3 minutes. Deshawn, Daniel's younger nephew, was standing near the wall with his phone in his hand, but not looking at it, watching the room with the alert attention of someone who is beginning to understand the dimensions of something he has only ever seen a portion of. He looked at his uncle moving through the crowd, stopping to speak with a man who recognized him, embracing a woman who had served under him, taking a moment to speak with a young veteran who was clearly nervous and who by the time Daniel moved away was visibly less so. And Deshawn felt something reconfigure quietly in his understanding of the person he had grown up calling Uncle Dan. He had known his uncle his whole life. He had eaten dinner at his table and watched basketball games beside him and borrowed his tools and listened to his advice, and he had never fully understood what he was sitting next to. He understood now, at least the edge of it. Diane Reyes found Daniel between conversations and pulled him briefly aside. "How are you, actually?" she said. She was one of the 3 people in the world who asked Daniel that question and expected an honest answer rather than a performance of one. "I had an interesting flight," Daniel said. "I heard." She hadn't heard. She was making a professional assessment based on something in his face. Someone gave you trouble. Someone learned something, Daniel said. I think. Diane studied him. And you? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, I learned that I'm more tired of doing this gracefully than I thought I was. He said it without self-pity, the way a doctor might describe a symptom. Accurate, informative, not catastrophizing. I'm not saying I'd do it differently. I'm just saying there's a cost to it. And it's useful to name the cost. Diane nodded slowly. That's what the work is for, she said. She meant the program she ran, the room full of veterans, the infrastructure of people who understood what had been spent. I know, he said. The formal program began at 5 o'clock. There were remarks from a congressional representative who had spent 12 years on the Armed Services Committee and who spoke about the gap between the rhetoric of military honor and the material reality of veterans' lives, with a frankness that the room received, with the quiet approval of people who have waited a long time to hear it said directly. There were remarks from a retired four-star general who had the specific gift of brevity, saying in 5 minutes what most speakers take 20 to accomplish, and leaving more room for meaning in the space between his sentences than most people manage in paragraphs. There were 3 other award recipients before Daniel: a Navy corpsman from San Diego, a retired Air Force pilot, and a female Army combat veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq and who was now completing a medical degree at USC. Each of them received their award with the particular composure of people who have learned that formal recognition is both insufficient and, at some level, necessary. That it doesn't explain what happened, but it marks it, and marking matters. Daniel's name was called last. He walked to the podium with the same unhurried, deliberate pace he had used walking through the airport that morning, and he received the award, a bronze medallion on a dark blue ribbon, inscribed with language that the ceremony program described as representing the highest civilian recognition available to veterans. And he held it for a moment with both hands. He was given the microphone. The room was very quiet. I want to say something about the men and women in this room, he said. Not about the people receiving awards tonight, about everyone. About the ones in the back row and the ones who came because someone they love is being recognized and the ones who are here because they needed to be in a room with people who understand. He paused. Service is not a story that ends, he said. It doesn't stop when you come home. It becomes the way you live after you come home. The choices you make, the things you notice, the way you treat the people who can't do anything for you. I've been thinking about that today. He thought about Victor Langford. He didn't say the name. I've been thinking about the fact that most of what we did in our lives that mattered most was invisible. The people we helped who never knew our names. The decisions we made that nobody wrote down. The moments of patience that felt like they cost us something. Because they did. All of it invisible. He looked out at the room. I don't think that's a problem, he said. I think that's exactly what it's supposed to be. I think the greatest acts of courage in a person's life are the ones nobody sees, including sometimes the person doing them, because you're not thinking about how it looks. You're just doing what needs to be done because someone needs it done, and you happen to be there. He lifted the medallion slightly. This is generous, he said. I'm grateful for it. I'm going to carry it back to Virginia and put it next to the photograph I have of the men and women I served with, and I'm going to look at both of them and try to keep doing what needs to be done. He stepped back from the microphone. The room began to applaud, and then it was on its feet, and the sound in the conference center had the weight and texture of 300 people who had been given something they needed. Daniel stood at the podium and received it. He did not look away. He did not deflect. He let the full weight of it fall on him, and he bore it with the same composure he brought to everything, not as armor, but as the settled sureness of a man who knows what he has done, and what it cost, and what it was worth. In the back of the room, standing near the entrance with a paper cup of coffee going cold in his hand, Calvin Osei watched. He was thinking about his uncle. He was thinking about the fact that Anthony had been 22 years old and had made a decision in the last seconds of a mission that had made it possible for Daniel to pull those men out of the aircraft. He was thinking about how you account for that, how you tell a story that includes a death inside it. and still finds the through line that makes meaning. He thought, maybe the meaning is this: the man receiving the award, the nephews learning who their uncle was. The program Diane Reyes ran, with 200 veterans who had steady jobs because one woman had taken her experience and built something out of it. The pilot who was alive. The 17 years of flight hours. The approaches into every airport in the country. The aircraft arriving safely again and again and again. All of it downstream of one morning. All of it alive because something had been sacrificed and something had been saved. He raised his paper cup very slightly, to no one in particular, and he said something under his breath that he had rehearsed in the car on the way over. And that came out now the way things come out when you've been carrying them long enough. They got out, man. They all got out. The applause in the conference center continued. Daniel nodded, once, deeply, and walked back to his seat. Marcus, his nephew, was on his feet. Deshawn was on his feet. Carolyn was crying in the particular way she cried, which involved no sound and considerable determination. Jerome had his arm around her. Harold Sims was standing with the deliberate firmness of a man whose knees have been informed that this particular moment is non-negotiable. And Diane Reyes, standing at the edge of the family group, watched Daniel cross the room with his medallion in his hands, and his shoulders carrying the weight of the evening, the way they carried everything. Steadily, without drama, without the performance of suffering, or the performance of triumph. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone has built themselves into something real, across years and miles and costs that don't show up on any ledger anyone will ever read. This is what it looks like when that person comes home. The evening continued. Dinner was served. Conversations opened and deepened and moved through the rooms in the way they always do at gatherings like this, with the particular energy of people for whom shared experience is both the foundation and the reason. Harold Sims found 3 men he had never met who had served in overlapping conflicts and talked with them for 2 hours about the logistics of an era that most of the country had stopped talking about. Diane Reyes exchanged information with the congressional representative about a funding gap in the Veterans Transition Program that had been pending review for 11 months. Calvin Osei sat at a table with 2 other veterans who had lost people in similar circumstances, and they talked about grief in the specific, un-euphemized way that people talk about it when they know they're in a room where the word has its actual meaning. Daniel moved through it all with the ease of a man in the right place. He spoke to people when they wanted to speak, sat with people who needed someone to sit with them, and at one point found a quiet corner near the windows where he could look out at the lit campus and the hills beyond it, and simply breathe for a moment. He thought about the flight. He thought about Michael Reynolds, who he had not managed to speak with before deplaning. He had written a note to the flight crew and left it with Emily to pass forward, and he trusted that Reynolds would receive it, because Emily Carter struck him as someone who followed through on things. He thought about Emily herself, about the specific quality of professional integrity she had demonstrated by making a phone call she wasn't required to make. He thought about Victor Langford, not with anger, not with the residual satisfaction of someone who has been vindicated, with something closer to concern, the kind that comes from recognizing that a person you've briefly known is at the beginning of something difficult and doesn't yet know how long it will take. He hoped it would go somewhere useful. He thought it might. The man had stood up. On the aircraft, on the taxiway, before the fasten seatbelt sign had chimed off, Victor had stood up, and he had clapped with both hands. That was something. It wasn't enough. It was something. The mountains of Kunar province were very far from this conference center in Westwood, and the morning that had made this evening possible was 17 years behind him, and Private First Class Anthony Osei had been 22 years old, and the Pacific was visible tonight as a dark shimmer at the edge of the hills, and Daniel Brooks was 60 years old and standing at a window in Los Angeles with a bronze medallion on a blue ribbon in his hand, breathing the kind of air that only exists at the end of a day that has asked everything of you and given something back. He pressed his thumb to the inside of his wrist. He said very quietly, "They got out, Anthony. They all got out." And then he turned back to the room, back to the people, Back to the noise and the warmth and the ongoing, unglamorous, essential work of being present for the ones who are still here. Back to the conversations and the handshakes and the names being learned and the stories being carried from one person to another, like flames passed carefully in the dark. He walked back in. His sister saw him coming and made room. The greatest acts of courage are rarely witnessed. The most significant lives are rarely announced. Honor does not require an audience, but sometimes at 35,000 feet, it finds one anyway. And sometimes, that's exactly enough.